introduce you?
Sure.
Okay. So, welcome everyone to the 2021 New Orleans Poetry Festival. I'm Jonathan Pinton from the NOPF board. Before we get started, we want to thank our major sponsors this year, especially the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Foundation and the Academy of American Poets, who have helped us keep this year's fest free and open for all. It's glad to see you with us at this event, and then we hope you see you at the many others we'll be hosting throughout the month of April. All you have to do to attend is go to nolapoetry.com. Check out the calendar and click on the event. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Kristi Maxwell, who's going to moderate this event. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Will someone on the panel please email Annie the number that I sent out so she is able to sign on?
I'll do it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you all for using your time this way today to spend some time with us thinking about the poetics of climate change. I'm happy that we were able to make this panel happen this year since we were not able to do it last year. So thank you for inviting us back. Thank you for kind of honoring that the acceptance for last year's panels for this year's conference. I'm excited to hear what all of the panelists have to say. When I put out a call for this panel, it included a question posed by Matthew Griffiths in the new Poetics of Climate Change. He asks, must poetry of climate change belong in the tradition of the pastoral or the elegy? What alternative models or approaches might there be? This panel will illuminate some of those alternative models and approaches. Look, I see Annie here. Oh, God. I'm going to start by talking a little about my current work, Goners, which is what inspired me to kind of put this panel together. It's interested in the ill logics of mass extinction, a play on kind of the sick logics, and of course the rational. Poems from this manuscript are a series of lipograms, writing that excludes one or more letters. The poems take as their starting place the names of endangered species and emerged out of a desire to manage my own climate despair. Specifically, I'm working with a variation of the beautiful outlaw, lipograms that do not use the letters in a subject's name, in this case, the name of the endangered species, a variation I've come to call an extinction, to explore what happens when what is endangered is instead absent or gone. The piece Cheetah, for instance, uses 21 of 26 letters, all but A, C, E, H, and T. So no articles, no cats, no being, no are or were or was, no choice, etc. The formal strategy of the lipogram nods to the global trends regarding climate change and strategies of elimination, eliminating carbon emissions, red meat consumption, plastic, and so on. When I first began sharing drafts of these poems with my writing group, they kept asking, but where's the animal? Expecting the species in the individual poem titles to be reflected upon in the poems themselves. Instead, the pieces tend to be human-centered, a gesture I at first resisted, but then gave into because it seems to foreground the role human centering has played and continues to play in the sixth extinction underway. What I stress now, I'm not writing about endangered species. I'm writing without them. Attempting to imagine in a linguistic landscape the ways that loss would be registered and accommodated, or the ways in which one would be unable to accommodate it, to adapt. The mournful thing to me about writing these is the ways they serve as reminders about human adaptability, the relative ease with which we move on from and suppress erasures in which we are implicated, and an unwillingness or inability to confront the changes rendered by those erasures because enough has remained the same, even as things become increasingly untenable. And this can extend beyond non-human animal erasures, beyond the extinction of species. I'm thinking of genocides and the corrosive effects of imperialism and industrialization, but also the glaciers melt as erasure, deforestation as erasure, ocean acidification as at least a bad revision in which the wrong things have been added in or edited out. Perhaps worth noting, I've come to call the poems in the manuscript my demented arc. Each piece has a companion piece, meaning there are 2 poems generated for each endangered species, playing on the story of the arc and founding mythologies about intervention and preservation bound up in it. I'm going to read 3 of those pieces now before handing over the platform to the other panelists. Kui-wee, an extinction. I always find this interesting. The definition of kui-wee is just a really like thing to me. It says, kui-wee is an endangered sucker. There's just something so chewy to think through in that. Flesh forward to now. My harlot remnant opposed the haggle. Maybe gastronomy gave more to the world than gene therapy overall. My lament sponsored by my damages. A story on wellness's edge. Forgotten as a globe. The aloha ghost long ago harmed by a voyager. We gave the sea a sampler of flotsam. The sea preferred none of what we gave. Bon voyage, dear anthropomorph. The fever, as an earth does, has thawed. The onlooker weans her own eyes off the handsome loam, the go-between between growth and harvest, the besotted spore. How have we gone from agro to agro, from leaf to leaflet? The pamphleteer hankers for new goals and for more paper, fresh as wet blood. Mao Mao, an extinction. Edified by renewed cells, but besides insides surprise unruins, terrible, utterly delinquent relief, sulking elsewhere. In reruns, we review Eden's western lung wheezing, punctured by infinite suffering. This denuded requiem, just ting beside ting, this single bell, stuffing its gutted tin pelt, pretending this swinging pistol will still seed. A keiki, an extinction. Conscious of nightly symbols forming on historic forts, how to unfold, unmoor, unmission, to join, issuing forth your country into my country. So hot, so unbound, not occupying, but simply touching. My own tropic cools, this fusing isthmus shorts. Dibs on unwounding. Stop this posturing, this conviction disposition, dust gluttonous, tumor thorough, thoroughly mining this bituminous night for lost hours, pumicing our moon's bright foot, involving full-grown miners or mirrors in this whodunit, trying not to, but noticing this world's voluminous booty, flossing with history's thong, with history's wrongs showing. Monolithic thoughts build phobic logics. It's on us to unbuild. Clog this porous wisdom with your good, or mostly good, oil. I'm thrilled now to hand the platform over to the panelists, Oliver Baez Bendorf, Annie Finch, Kristen Miller, and Bronwen Tate. We decided that it would be easiest for everyone to put their bio in the chat so that you can read that and have any links that might be relevant to the readers. So when you come to the when you introduce yourself, just remember to put that bio in the chat. Thank you. All right, Oliver.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to be here with you. Kristi, thank you so much for wrangling us together. That was great to hear your work and about it, and I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone else today. Here is my bio. There's a link also in there to text of the poems that I'm going to read today, if you prefer to follow along that way. And Bill and Megan, thank you always for putting this on and everything that you do. My work is sort of at the places where queer poetics and eco-poetics meet. And just briefly as context for the poems I'll read today, to ideas that I've been exploring in the poems I'm working on right now are shelter, the ways that we can offer it to each other, and the ways that we seek that in each other, and also what can happen in the shelter of a poem, and how does this all also have anything to do with the vulnerability of queer and trans people to the effects of climate change due to the sort of disproportionate experiences of homelessness. As many as 2 and 5 homeless youth are LGBTQ, and as many as 1 in 5 LGBTQ adults have experienced homelessness in their lifetime. And so I'm thinking about that, this sort of vulnerability to the elements, and also shelter and also nonconformity. So these traditions, like queer and trans traditions of nonconformity, and joyful resistance, and how those can be sort of uniquely suited to facing climate change, and invitations or even incitements to nonconformity in the face of climate change. So colony collapse begins without shelter in a storm. What I have to do next. I sleep best at anyone else's house. I like the ones that bees like. I think madness is colonization. I know grace is how I'm still alive. Shock of blue jay on an oxidized fence. I try to make a religious exception. Don't die of perfection. Heave along the goldenrod. Begin to live more together. I try to unravel Spanish ways of knowing. For example, crown on my head in an empty field. We plant lavender and let it grow bushy for the bees. Sexy how they feed on blooms. Pleasure, time, money, faith, yucca, evil. Each one multiplies. We never eat alone. Come over, I will be a confidential lover to each one of you. Private things, private thoughts. We bake breadcrumbs into royal jelly. I love with every hand, horse, water, wind. If you wonder where to rear the young, if you too fall feverish after that communal feeling, swear to God, when I'm dead, I'll spend years waiting for the living to call, offer wine and dance. I need everyone I love. I'm too tired. Time to feed our missing before they come gone. Third eye is a glory hole. Doors open, soup's on. Impervious. Someone stops over unannounced like the old days, so I pop open that bottle of Sancerre I've been saving. Talk turns to carp that reach the roadway after Thursday's 3 inches of rain. How some said, invasive, let them die. Others said, naturalized, let them live. Someone asked for a net, and others said they'd catch them with their hands. I could never do what the raccoon does, tossing pink petals, or could I? We go to the club that turns gay only on Saturday nights. In the morning, I'm still gay, thank God. But the rain, it's returning. This next one, it starts on an epigraph that's an excerpt from a speech that Sylvia Rivera gave in 1972. And it was that, so this, to situate that, is 3 years after Stonewall, which she, played a leading role in as one of the trans activists. And so this speech that she gave was at the Christopher Street Liberation Parade. And by that point, she had been sort of spending the day being trained by the predominantly white and not trans attendees there, had been booed all day and tried to sort of be like chased off the stage. And so this is from when she finally made it up on stage and addressed the crowd. And it's known as her "Y'all Better Quiet Down" speech. So this poem starts on that. And the poem's called Michigan. And this is from her speech. You all tell me, go and hide my tail between my legs. I will no longer put up with this shit. I have been beaten. I have had my nose broken. I have been thrown in jail. I have lost my job. I have lost my apartment for gay liberation. And you all treat me this way? What the fuck's wrong with you all? Think about that. Daisy Fleabane arrives early after winter onslaught of lake effect. Snow melt becomes water that feeds wildflowers from the underside, becomes flood, comes family, a cellular structure for secrets. The year is 2020. Everyone is sick and healing. Not everyone. Everyone is sick or healing. Lives are precious or expendable. Expelled, expressed, released, sighed, sloughed off to replicate in someone else's precious or expendable lungs. Germination, occupation, months between vagus nerve and a memory of sociality. You might as well be in Michigan. I rolled into a pleasant peninsula seeking safe haven. And yes, sometimes an invisible cloak fits over my house. Caped children walk right by carrying plastic pumpkins. I push grass ordinance to edges. A local construction of crime, legal height lowered. Rehearsing arguments with neighbors. I mow a tiny strip around the meadow. The pollinator garden tickles the curb with liberated wildflowers. Fleabane daisies, such a startling puff of yellow, pink clover right over, and dock, dead limbs rotting, but controlled into compost. We will grow things here. We are in this together. I'll post a sign explaining and pray no one calls on the rooster who rushes to elevation to greet the day or warn of it. All day the same bugle meaning something only in his kingdom, which I happen to live in. I surround myself in brown, deck stains and elk and moose of the Michigan flag. State whistle, toad song. Don't you know, sun cooks the shame away. Who else needs to survive? I am trying to answer one question. I measure miles from the arbitrary border, drive through pharma for extra vials of testosterone, controlled substance. Our ex sees a criminal queer, scrutinizes ID, then dispenses a paper bag, folded, closed, and stapled, which I toss empty passenger seat, sanitize my hands, keep driving, fueled by fossils, north in Michigan. What is a mortgage? Is it a house of cards? A debt meant never to be repaid? Token of achievement in settlements, shadow? Am I the last loser in Michigan, still banking on silence and pleasantries to protect me? Strangers, neighbors power walk past my ragged lawn. Their yards are dull and starve hummingbirds, monarchs, cardinals, and bees. How is that more beautiful? If I stay in line, if I keep my head down, if I work harder, etc., copying myself. I have held my tail between my legs and sang grateful. I have been spit on for whose hand I held, harassed for the pants I wore, catcalled for existing. I have been slandered by the God Hates Fags family. I have studied their church compound on Google Street View and seen the Pride Center painted in rainbow across the street. I can no longer be placated by the colorful advancement of rights. Depressed to push or pull down, no wonder. An old ordinance still on the books bans fortune telling. Another way I am a criminal here. Between that and the forbidden meadow and some other elements and the privileges I am often permitted, I forgot to assemble, paid on time every month, did homophobia's work by playing Smear the Queer. Sylvia didn't die for me to hide my tail between my legs. Untethering from my respectable nest, holding the X in my hand like a rosary and like a brick. I'm done being good. This one's called All I Have Is the Woods Inside My Head. Minerva, calm me down. I am trying to remember the way the deer always emerged every time I thought of them, and how bones would surface in the dirt at the marsh. I'm sniffing pine cones back to the forest floor, rubbing fingers together to make moss, smoking toward the orchard where I could never find the owl in the rotting tree. What kind of tree? I can't remember. Years pass. I'm at my desk doing a hormone shot with my cam off and trying to remember when someone in the webinar on trans femme aesthetics says they don't believe anything's innate. I laugh on mute. I too have been tossing nurture nature in my mind, but who hasn't? Now, what God threw up this unforgettable sunset tonight? I step out to the deck in my trans mask robe because in the end, no one will remember. All that I've named has a life outside of me. On certain days when the humidity is just right, I remember everything. I regret nothing. Birch tree. Okay, I'm just gonna finish up with these two that are from this thing that I'm kind of working on right now. And so let's see. Okay. I want these are imagined as kind of like wall text going along with arts that doesn't exist except for in these poems. Okay. I want biodegradable sex, 2021, polypropylene, moss, human hair, pine needles, cardboard, sheepskin condoms, coffee grounds. This sculpture reveals the demand my transition has created for the plastics industry over time. By melting plastic syringes into a compressed form, I hope to create an anticlimax by showing all at once the slow accumulation of material. When you observe me and then the sculpture, is the volume of plastic more or less than what you would expect? Do you agree strongly, agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, or strongly disagree that certain plastics should remain single use? By incorporating an assortment of organic elements, I wanted to create a sense of grief out of the cognitive dissonance. Plasticos, to form or mold an art long before plastics were invented. Trans is a way of arranging the world through change, but plastic is durable, meaning it never goes away. Very light gets blown along in gentle winds. It gets washed by rain into sewers, streams, rivers, and finally oceans. It burns forever in landfills, a sickening campfire around which we tell scary stories. It is pleasurable at times when a container fulfills the functions for which it has been designed. I hope to return to Earth a little bit more every day until I'm finally you again. Who profits from this feeling? 2021. Coffee filters, clay, red string, mist machine, tempera paint, binoculars, goat's wool. The rainbow is a collection of rays with particular directions, and gender is like a cone of light opening outward. I wanted to show the way some people are so obsessed that it becomes a kind of constriction. Worse than a snake, they would choke for all of us the otherwise open flow of solar rays, creating a so-called bottleneck through which every other issue must pass. Each person has their own cone and sees their very own rainbow. It does not otherwise exist, and it is not located at any particular point in space. If you have accumulated something like shame, you are invited to practice every day getting rid of it. You could walk it to the edge of your body and out the door and down the street over and over and over again. However many times it takes, return to sender. The rainbow angle is the angle of minimum deviation. Who benefits from this distraction? Particulates from wildfire make their way into every new experience. Thank you so much.
Man, those were so wonderful, Oliver. Thank you. Next up, we have Annie Finch. I'm trying to pin you, Annie.
Hello, here comes my bio. So, hi everybody. This is really fun to be back at this festival. I think I was here once before and had a lot of fun. Yeah, and good to see some friends and acquaintances and people I haven't met yet, but would love to. I've been thinking a lot about these issues, and actually my husband does a solar energy activist, so I think a lot about climate change stuff. And I also think a lot about permaculture, which I find extremely resonant as metaphor. And so I want to talk today about my thoughts on the permaculture of poetry. And permaculture might not seem directly related to climate change, but in fact it really is. And permaculture has been really proposed as a very strong way of mitigating climate change. Permaculture, as many of you probably know, and I'm no expert or anything, but I just metaphorically, I'm very interested in it. It works with natural systems. It plants together in kind of groupings that aren't necessarily separated by different plants together. Like say you have a permaculture garden, it would kind of blend plants that help each other out, like tall plants with plants that need the shade, and kind of cluster them. And eventually you can even create something that feels very much like a natural ecosystem, but it's actually a garden, so it's self-sustaining. It's really, really cool. And so what I've been thinking about for this presentation is some of the basic principles of permaculture and how the poetics that I practice and that I teach and that I do everything I can to spread far and wide are perhaps akin in some ways to the principles of permaculture. So for my sort of idea of the principles of permaculture, I went to some writings by Matthew Stevens, who's a well-known popularizer of permaculture. And his basic principles he talks about, I'll just go through them one by one and talk about them briefly in terms of poetics, and then I'll close with a couple of poems. So permaculture is my handwriting. Perennial, yes, perennial. It works with the idea of plants that are perennial and in sustainable systems. So it's perennial and sustainable. And as some of you may know, the poetics that I practice involve pattern, repetition, the structures of repetition of all kinds. But particularly, I am most passionate and excited about meter itself, because to me, meter is the most juicy and granular and sensuous and malleable and exact and just flexible and explosive and eloquent version of patterning available in language. I mean, it's so eloquent that it's below the surface of language or word or meaning, and it's just palpable, and it even, to me, works like energy waves. So I'm just really psyched about meter. And to me, meter it's perennial and sustainable in the sense that, and all poetic form I feel is this way as well, that you can look at it on the larger scale as being perennial and sustainable because forms actually grow into other forms. They get passed on from poet to poet. You know, when one person plays around with something like I don't know, or invents something, the ghazal or the paradel or the, you know, the sestina or whatever, what's his name, that one? Harry Matthews did all that great stuff with the sestina, you know. So, and this is also interests me a lot because nobody can ever figure out if I'm a formalist and like what that means, and or am I experimental, and like I think in the intersection between experimental poetics and traditional poetics, there is this exciting edge that I love to inhabit. And to me, form and pattern are all about that. It's about a kind of a reification of form at the same time, a listening to form and an inhabit, you know, so it's just right on that edge between subject and object and inside and outside and self and other that I just love to inhabit, the physical and the spiritual. It's like right there between all those things. So I think, you know, that it's the obvious way that it's perennial and sustainable. Sometimes I think of forms like heirloom seeds or heirloom apples or something that, you know, that you can reclaim old ones that have been lost. I'm especially interested in what I call metrical diversity, which is bringing people back beyond iambic pentameter. I've been actually kind of dismayed, and I can say that here, hopefully people will know what I'm talking about. As someone who's very excited about the variety of meters, I've been surprised and dismayed, but maybe not, well, maybe not too surprised by the way even the most experimental poets are metrically extremely conservative. You know, people can be all out there with their theory and with their ideas about language and signification and things like that, and self and the author, the I, the lyric I, whatever. They can be all over the place about this stuff. When it comes to meter, they go back to iambic pentameter. I mean, it is just really, really kind of sad to me because, you know, there are a lot of other meters out there, and that iambic pentameter, that was Ezra Pound, his first heave was to break iambic pentameter. It wasn't to break meter in general. He wanted to break iambic pentameter, which had a stranglehold on poetic meter. And now people have gone full circle through this century of total freedom and liberation, and right back to iambic pentameter again. You could, whether consciously or even just unconsciously, it pops up, and you can see that iambic pentameter still has a stranglehold on experimental poetics, as well as, of course, mainstream poetics and free verse poetics. So I'm very interested in educating people about all the metrical options out there, so at least these options become conscious. So anyway, a little bit of a roundabout, but it brings us to the next idea, which is going to be diversity of forms. But just to finish a little bit more about sustainable, I feel that meter is sustainable not only in the sense of that forms are handed on from poet to poet, and in that sense, it conserves a kind of energy, and you know, things aren't leaked through the cracks generation to generation, but there's a kind of a nice efficiency to it, which doesn't necessarily have to be a retrograde thing. I mean, there's experimentation and growth constantly, but also I find them sustainable in a much more exciting way, to me, a sort of a metaphysical way, that meter sustains itself energetically, because when I do really deep scansion of great poems, I discover that meter itself, like on the foot level, and the variations within it, the way they interact with the expressive, the signification of the words themselves, it creates a kind of, it seems to me, a feedback loop of energy where the metrical variation itself can create a meaning that shows up in the meaning of the word, and then the meaning of the word reinforces the variation within the meter itself. And this creates a kind of energy that leads, I think, in many cases in my own experience writing, but also in the experience of reading and scansion, it leads to more energy that then rolls over into the next foot and just creates kind of this perpetual kind of little engine, almost like I imagine it might happen inside a solar cell, though I don't really know how those work much. But there's something going on that's very, very nifty. That's very, I don't know. It's efficient and yet surprising within that the micro level of meter itself. So in that way, I find it sustainable and perennial in a really cool way, not the obvious way you think of with forms getting carried on through history. So there's that. Then there's the diverse and cooperative aspect of permaculture, where it's much more about diversities of plants, all kinds of different variations of familiar plants, but also other plants. And of course, this is one thing I love so much about form, is that it's really multiplicitous. There's so many options, whether you're inventing your own or working with other ones or variations on other ones. I mean, there's a ton of options. And to me, it's just really fun to read a book that has very clear different forms in it, like they're different, like different plants popping up, as opposed to, free verse, in terms of, the repeating aspects, it's kind of limited. So it's a little more like a monoculture. You've got the line breaks, and then you can do a lot of cool stuff within that. You've got the open field, maybe you've got the long lines, the short lines, but it's not like all the different intersections of pattern and variety that you can have when you're playing around with with so many different things, or all about this, you're all poets, but refrain and repetition and the sound and the look and the interlockings and the patterns and all the different stuff, the hidden stuff, the obvious stuff. So it's just, there's so much diversity and cooperation, I find, also between like the foot level, the line level, the stanza level, the refrain level, there's all these different levels of a formal poem that cooperate with each other and create this really cool synergy. So another aspect of permaculture is that it recycles energy and nutrients, which I guess kind of comes back to some of the things I've already been saying, but clearly things can be recycled not only from poet to poet, but also within the poem. I do feel that you can have the same words. Actually, this is another way really where you can have the same exact word be recycled, say in a really brilliant villanelle, even something like that. The same word can appear in different contexts and mean a completely different thing, which makes a really fun experience, sort of a recycling experience of the words that you see repeating. So there's that. Then permaculture makes use of the edges. I love this. I just love this because, of course, with form, it's all about edges. And I've invented my own simple words for scansion terminology because I've just been teaching it forever and in so many in different contexts. So I've come up with, there's not that really many great words for like the accent mark, the unaccented mark. You can say short and long, but that's really based on Greek and Latin, or you can say, I don't know, some brave or some pompous thing, or you can say something unwieldy like unaccented mark or whatever. But so I've invented these phrases. I use wand and cup based on the tarot because I'm a witch. So I've got wands and cups, then I've got ghost cups, which are the ones that have parentheses around them because they're either there and they shouldn't be, or they shouldn't be and they are there. So those are fun. And then for the foot boundary, which is a word I absolutely despise, I use the word edge. It took me like 20 years of teaching to finally find the right noun for this. Very simple, concrete nouns, but they're easy to play with. So edge is what I use for foot boundaries. So when I saw this principle of permaculture, they make use of the edges, I was really excited because, that is exactly maybe my favorite thing about using form in poetry is the edges, whether it's edges between foot and foot, and just what happens between them, the way the same syllable can be stressed in one context, unstressed in another, and it all depends on what is in the foot with it. So, the edge is all, or whether it's the edges between lines, the edges, between stanzas, or even the edges between poems in a sequence, or the edges between akin poems by different poets in the same form. I mean, there's just so many different edges to play with. And I am a bird name as well, so birds often like edge habitat. So I do love edge habitat. And then finally, Matthew Stevens' final principle of permaculture is that it looks for solutions within the problems themselves. I love that. And again, working with a form, I always feel that I'm finding the solution out of the problem. When I'm stuck, I don't know if the poem is finished. I'll just keep going with it, and then I'll come up with, something will arise out of the problem, like just by manipulating it, as I'm sure you all do so often, because we're poets. I don't know, maybe not every poet likes to, but I think a lot of poets like to kind of puzzle solve or whatever. Like there's a satisfaction in making things go and into patterns. And I think that process is one of finding solutions within the problems themselves, like just rearranging the problem and looking at it until the solution emerges that's a larger pattern. So I love that. And that is one of the reasons I love to work with form, just because when a poem doesn't feel finished to me, I just can keep on playing with the problem itself rather than trying to bring new things in, but just looking at the problem until it kind of emerges into something. So in these ways, I find that working with meter and form is an exercise in permacultural principles for me. And I also feel that working in meter and form can be, I'm in Portugal, but it's cold, that working in meter and form can be helpful, I think, in another way for climate change, that I really do feel that it brings other elements into poetry to compete with the power of the mind in current poetics. I think the mind has become so preeminent in most poetry nowadays. And for me, form is so sensual, so palpably sensual, that it brings the body in. It is so palpably emotionally moving that it brings the heart in. It is so, I don't know, it's so inspiring that it brings the will in, and it is so humbling that it brings the spirit in. So to me, bringing in poetic form and I've seen it over and over in my classes. I'll teach form to poets who have never had the opportunity to learn it before, because so few of us do nowadays. And they will often find it really life-changing. And I feel it's for these reasons, that it gives permission to bring the body, the heart, the will, and the spirit into one's poetry in equal proportion with the mind. And I have whole systems I've developed where I have like a meter that goes with each of those things: mind, body, heart, will, spirit. I mean, it's just, I do all this holistic stuff with it. I've done it with people who have zero poetic background, but we work with the rhythms as a healing, self-transformative tool and self-transformational tool. And it is, just amazing stuff. So I feel that in this way, it's healing to us as humans, and it helps remind us of our connections with the earth and with each other, and the cycles of our bodies and how they connect to the cycles of the earth and the seasons, and all of these rhythms I just find connect us more into ourselves as animals, as responsible members of the ecosystem that we're in. So these are all the reasons that I like to think of the permaculture of poetry. I'll close with 3 poems. They're not that long. They're all very carefully wrought, and they took me a long time to write, most of them. One of them took, I think I started with the last one I'll read. I started in 1985, and it's had so many different forms over the years. It used to be an iambic pentameter, then it was a pantoum. Now it's an anapestic, is it still a pantoum? Yeah, I guess it is. Anyway, yeah, so here they are. And I'll say, my next book, I've just finished my next book of poems. It took a long time. I had it finished basically in like 2011. And then I realized that based on the theories I was developing about metrical diversity and the importance of experimenting, exploring different meters, that I really needed to divide this book into 5 different sections and have each section be entirely in a different meter. So I did that, and it took me another 9 years of work, or well, it took me until now, so I guess that's even longer, 10 years. And now I've just finished it. And I'm going to read the kind of the structuring poem that's in 5 parts. And each part is only 2, it's a 10-line poem. And each part, it's a 10-line poem, and it's really 5 separate poems. Each one is 2 lines long, and each one is the opening to one of the 5 sections of the book. So you're really getting the overview of the full cycle of the book. And I'm gonna cry. I haven't done this before, and I just finished the book. And you'll find each of these is in a different meter. There are 5 meters in the book. So the first one is for the East. They're invocations. It creates a sacred circle, basically, as in being a witch. So each one invokes a different direction in the sacred circle. So the first one is iambic, and it invokes the East, which is the direction of the mind. But I just yesterday, I had this incredible Ayurvedic massage, and I listened to this chakra meditation afterwards. The massage therapist put on, and I realized that I'm not going to start with the mind anymore in the East. I'm actually going to start in the South with the will. So I'm going to read them to you in a new order. Okay, so this is, the first one will be anapestic, and that's about the will. The second is going to be iambic. That will be an invocation to the East, to the direction of the mind. The third will be trochaic. That's an invocation to the direction of the North, the body. Then the West will be dactylic. That's to the heart in the West. And then finally, we'll have the center. In amphibrax is the meter I use for the center, and this is invocation to the spirit, the direction of the spirit. Spell to cast a circle. Speak aloud once or thrice for each one as you face its direction. Invocation to the south. Move my life, live my spark, spark my fire, fire my will my dance, dance desire. To the east. Find wings, find wind, move free, move air, muse, make, weave spell, sing us aware. To the north. Seed of strength now root and ground us, rich earth, gratitude surround us. West, heart of the waves rocking flow in us, love sweet as water come grow in us. Center, come spiral of joy the beginner, below and above center spinner. The circle is cast, we are between worlds, and what happens between worlds changes all the worlds. I'll just stop right there. Thank you.
That was really something. I feel changed. So thank you. That was beautiful, Annie. Yeah. Next up, we're going to have Kristen Miller, and I'm going to pin you now, Kristen.
Hi, can someone do me a favor and just let me know if you can hear me well? Haven't done this through headphones before.
We can hear you fine. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful, thank you so much. It's good to be back. Blipped out there for a second and downloaded Zoom on my phone in the meantime, so now I'm back. Very excited to be with you today. Let me quickly drop, I think I can drop something in the chat from here. Thank you so much, Annie and Oliver, for those beautiful readings. I caught part of each of them, and they were so special, and I'm so glad to be here in your company today. Hello, thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to Kristi for having this idea over a year ago, and to the New Orleans Poetry Festival for believing in this panel and hosting all of us. My name is Kristen Miller, and I have the distinct honor of translating the poet Marie-Andrée Gill. Gill is a member of the Innu Nation, whose traditional territory stretches across the Canadian provinces of Quebec and Labrador. And I'm here today on behalf of her work, specifically her project in her second book, Spawn, which was published in English almost exactly 1 year ago next Friday. In Spawn, ecological decline is described in the context of colonialism and its development, logging, overfishing, and pollution in the natural landscape of the Mashteuiatsh Reserve. Throughout the collection, the uninhabitable land is closely linked to the uninhabitable language of the colonizers, in this case, French, which is the language in which Gill writes. As in many indigenous communities, the native language of Innu Aimun is giving way to French as the dominant language, and part of Gill's project formally is to create tension and discomfort in the way in which she wields French, often by resisting its conventions. These formal choices in these micro poems mount a resistance of colonialism that's as much about its effect on the land as it is on the language. And so I've selected a handful of her brief untitled poems, which draw out those themes. The lake eats away a little more cement with bleeding gums, and I want this whole thing over with, like that first French on the rampart. We are everywhere, lost. To lick the skin of the water with a tongue I don't speak. The day lifts me up on his shoulders to watch the varnish half stripped from our memories, the cement pelt poured over our feral skins. How to augur anything but crooked miracles anyway. In houses all alike, women embroider your future on moccasins sold to tourists. The light comes and goes. Timisham says only thunderstorms still tell it like it is. How do you swallow the lake's beauty with all these ghosts chewing through its plastic-filled lung? I'm in the underwater level of a video game, just as the air runs out, just as that little tune begins to play. Sometimes the sky pulls down his starry leggings and comes hot in the lake's wide mouth. It's always there, that color of mixed diesel pulsing through the two-stroke organs of our winter bunkers. We bathe in the malaise of hot asphalt, waiting for a habitable word, waiting to win the scratch-off lottery and take to the woods forever. Digging a finger through the rampart's fresh cement, writing a name, never the same one. Before the lake and its gills of raw sky, where the wind whistles a country song forever. It's time to sober up for the thirst for certain waters. Who knows the color of a sore throat cut loose? A lynx drags her claws down the tender gullet walls of the ones who drown before birth. Now voila, we have these yellow-orange floats and seal fins to open up our eyes. Splitting the surface of the lake, stripping the pelt from its shoulders, where sweetwater salmon drink the milk of our fallow hearts. We cut our teeth on weapons, I know we are blue spruce, the symmetry, we are blue plumage, the symmetry of spruce, the language of hailstones. And I will stop there. I want to close with a bilingual poem that's not in Spawn, but which draws from a poem in Spawn. If you've translated poetry or if you've studied translation, you know that a finished poem is often just a fragment of the exchange that's taken place between languages. So I made this poem in order to unpack the process of translating just 3 lines in one of Guy's poems. And it happens to be one of the poems that links the impact of colonialism on Innu land and on its language. And what I hope it shows is the richness of possibility in her work and the sort of limitless unfolding that can take place in a translation. Nous nous baignons dans le mal de vivre. We bathe ourselves in le mal de vivre. Nous nous baignons, we wade in, we swim, we submerge dans le mal de vivre, in the misery, the unhappiness. We wade in the profound discontentment. We bathe in the malaise de l'asphalte chaude. In the noxious bloom of a newly paved lot, in the malaise of hot asphalt, we bathe. Nous nous baignons dans le mal de vivre, de l'asphalte chaude. The hot asphalt is the water we swim through, en attendant de trouver la parole, looking for la parole habitable, for a home-like, habitable word, a sustainable language, ou de gagner quelque chose au château, looking for landfall, a windfall, a lottery win. Hot asphalt is the water we tread as we wait for parole habitable, for a language to shelter in. Thank you so much.
I love the way that both Oliver and you, Kristen, have evoked the shelter. What a wonderful thing to be happening. Looking for an inhabitable world. I just always love hearing those. So thank you so much for reading them. And now we're going to move to our final panelist, Bronwen Tate.
Thank you so much. I'll just put the bio in, and then also inspired by Oliver, I dropped the text into a Google Doc in case that's helpful for anybody to be able to follow along that way. And I am joining you from UBC Vancouver Point Grey campus on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Musqueam people. And a while back, I wrote an article about gender and the quotidian in Lynn Heginian's My Life and Bernadette Mayer's Midwinter Day. At the time, my focus was on different time scales and representing the texture of existence, so the day, the life, and on how writing and thinking take place amidst tasks like chopping vegetables for soup or singing a child to sleep. But I also noticed that Heginian and Mayer's uses of metonymy had something to offer when it comes to writing about climate change. So today I'd like to talk briefly about how each poet uses metonymy and then read a few poems I wrote with those strategies in mind. It might be worthwhile to pause briefly and clarify what I mean by metonymy. Metaphor can be so much more dramatic, and what is metonymy exactly? We kind of know, but maybe not quite always. So metonymy here, I mean naming the part for the whole, the detail for the larger background. Thinking about movies has been helpful for me here. If metaphor is the montage, metonymy is the close-up, that tight clenched fist, or the drop of blood in the snow. For Heginian, naming metonymy explicitly becomes a way of focusing attention on the act of selection that each moment of writing involves. What do we name? What do we leave in background? And what implicit background does each act of naming suggest? For Mayer, in contrast, metonymy is about contiguity and connection, a commitment to trace the details of her daily life out beyond her immediate sphere and ask what else they touch and rely on. So let me offer a few examples. Over the course of my life, Heginian skillfully denaturalizes metonymy, a literary device easily taken for granted. Less noticeable than metaphor, metonymy can seem like mere transparent description. Heginian describes amply in my life, but she also engages in metapoetic breaks that announce her description as such. So I insert a description of agonizing spring morning freshness when through the open window, a smell of coal dust and buds of broken early grass, of school books and rotting apples, trails the distant sound of an airplane and a flock of crows. Each item in this list is metonymic of a larger context, from the buds of broken early grass representing a spring landscape to the distant sound of an airplane situating the poem in a time when airplanes exist to be heard and evoking the tedium of a classroom. Several pages later, Heginian explicitly identifies a description as metonymy. The sudden, brief, early morning breeze, the first indication of a day's palpability, stays high in the trees while flashing silver and green, the leaves flutter. A bird sweeps from one branch to another, the indistinct shadows lift off the crumpled weeds, smoke rises from the gravel quarry. All this is metonymy. Heginian's description is beautiful, but she does not allow her reader to settle into this beauty. By concluding all this is metonymy, she establishes these vivid details as selections, maybe arbitrary choices from an array of other options. The poem consequently invites readers to consider what is left out of selective description and imagine the larger context each chosen detail might stand for. Does smoke rising from the gravel quarry indicate a threat to the otherwise idyllic scene? Deliberately drawing us out of the immediate moment of description and into an awareness of this description as an act of language. For someone interested in writing about climate change, this might be seen as a challenge to name the smoke as well as the birds. Like Heginian, Mayer uses the long poem to explore metonymy, but rather than focusing on selection, she emphasizes contiguity, tracing paths of connection between everyday activities and larger political and economic conditions. Mayer insists not only on small town chores as legitimate source for poetry, but also on their connection to national and even global issues. Like My Life, Midwinter Day employs the trope of metonymy, but rather than foregrounding the artifice of selection, Mayer's metonymies reveal obscured connections between domestic life and public policies, institutions, and events, all of which, in retrospect, I see connect directly to climate change. Whether asking where her food comes from or connecting the library's reduced hours with global politics, Mayer traces paths between everyday experiences and larger environmental realities. So she writes, there's a sign on the door that from the first of the year, library hours will be curtailed due to fuel prices. I feel the library should be colder and open longer hours, but I would rather see the downfall of the Shah. Many would absorb these curtailed hours as mere personal nuisance. Indeed, Mayer's leap to the downfall of the Shah may initially come across as a juxtaposition. Upon closer observation, however, this leap is in fact not a leap, but a bridge that articulates an American dependence on fossil fuels and consequent US complicity with undemocratic regimes and takes a position on them. Mayer thus reads the global in the local and engages in systemic critique without vitiating personal agency. In contrast to her willingness to trace paths of contiguity, Mayer observes, we live in a society where clean independence of the past seems best, and the ability to eat all that filthy meat is more prized than love and poetry's family. Clean independence of the past involves a refusal to look deeply into origins and contexts. Meat here could be filthy because it is raised inhumanely, because it relies on exploitative labor, or because it is literally unsanitary, all possibilities people prefer to ignore when they sit down to dinner. In emphasizing such origins and contexts, Mayer shows how the domestic sphere is not and never has been a private space sealed off from the wider world. She shows that writing the home, if done thoughtfully, is also writing what enters and exits the home, what connects to it via power lines, library books, grocery stores, and voting lines. And now I'd like to read just a handful of poems written with these strategies in mind, poems that I would say reach towards acknowledging connection. Since we first proposed the paddle, I've moved again. So this time from Vermont to Vancouver. Before I had moved from San Francisco to Vermont. But I should say that these are Vermont poems. So the first section is from a long poem called How to Stay. Puddles, ice and mud and ice again. Robins restless, students dye their hair. Blue clings to the scalp. On the phone, I ask Hannah, is worry care or burden? Water to a tree is speech, so its absence. Care reaches, worry turns over and over. Stone in my hand, dog with a bone, transitive. It can take an object. I worry you. I worry the knot in this yarn. You worry me, you worry the tree by your window. Let the snow fall, let the warm front hover, and let the sleet fall. Let the roads ice over, let cars glide past lasting damage we mostly elide. We've walked slippery hills, known the grip that fails, seen how knowledge prevents nothing. We begin dark cookie set on a bookshelf for later. We begin, let her concussed cells speak, let his loose tooth fall out. Night, I tell my husband, unburdens, so let our daughter cry and then sleep. Feather drifting thick flakes of spring snow catch and melt in Vesper's curls. I'm an old half, she says, then koala crying. My neighbor lifts and shapes a tall vase, explains craft saturates into philosophy. I spread my hands between story and sound, sip wild white sage tea, brain finger-limbed, slipping yarn through parabolas of decrease. It's dinner time. Our children wedge the dough like clay, later like language, they devour it. I take it as the sea takes things, whether it wants them or not, plastic pail, half forever, vomited past a beached whale's gaping baleen when my children are dead. I refuse as water never can when I turn to look elsewhere. I take it like someone else's smoke in my lungs, like neighbors took the sound my crying son gave when we lived in the city. I don't refuse, I drink the water. Thank you.
That was fantastic. I've just really enjoyed everything that we've been able to hear today. Thank you all for being here and for those amazing presentations. My mind just feels like, just I'm gonna have a lot to dwell in, so thank you. I'm gonna open it up to questions and or comments or right now. So if you have something, please interject. You can write in the chat too, that's fine. Or you can are people able to unmute?
They are unable to
Yeah,
unmute
yeah.
themselves. Yeah,
I
we know.
missed who was the poet of the last poem. Was it you, Bronwen, or someone else? The one you just read.
Oh, the last one was me.
Oh, it's fabulous. Okay.
Thank you.
I'm trying to follow. And if you could spell the whatever that form is, I don't know this word.
Metonymy?
Yes, please. I think I do it, but I didn't know what it was called. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We could talk about metonymic detail or metonymic selection, right? Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Are there any questions? Maybe you're like me and you're just feeling kind of overwhelmed by all the things you're feeling. You're like, okay, well, I gotta just dwell in that before I can articulate anything.
I'd maybe love to hear from Annie about like teaching meter to the meter resistant, if, you know. Yeah,
Well,
thought that was so rich.
oh, thank you. Actually, I guess I now see it as lucky. I lost my university job, so I do not have university job. So I started my own teaching venue. So I'm teaching it online, and I don't have anyone who's meter resistant. I'm teaching it to people who want it. So a lot of poets who never had a chance to learn it before, and it's been just fantastic. Some of the people that I teach it in three different ways actually. I mean, I teach meter for just people who haven't had it before. So I do it, and then I also teach it to like yoga teachers and self-transformation seekers, people who are not necessarily poets. So in that way, they're not resistant, but they're completely ignorant or whatever. They have no
Unfamiliar.
preconceived notion. Unfamiliar, yeah, which is really fun because I discovered that when I've been teaching meter, gosh, I don't know, 30, 40 years. And when I first started, I found that I would put a lot of stuff into it. I would teach the history of the English language and how that all related to meter and things like that. And then as I've gone on and on teaching it, it's just gotten simpler and simpler and simpler. And like with the yoga teachers or whatever, I mean, basically I do this process that I call in training, that the yoga teacher came up with that name. And we just simply, I read aloud something in the meter. And with the non-iambic meters, it's sometimes hard to find examples, but I edited a little anthology. It's in Everyman's Library for it's called Measure for Measure, an anthology of poetic meters. So I can read something from there in each of the meters, and then like you read it aloud, and then sometimes I'll have a drum and I'll just drum out the meter afterwards, and I'll keep that going for a little while, and then I'll stop, and then they can just take it from there. So it's very much body memory, muscle memory, kind of a physical experience. And I found they just pick it up like that. I mean, like in 10 minutes, and in 2 or 3 hours, they can get all 5 meters, no problem. So, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. And when I used to teach it as, to undergrads, let alone graduate students who sometimes were more difficult to teach, I would, do this whole dog and pony show about, all the different things, blah, blah, blah. So now I really don't. But on the other hand, I also teach meter, and we go into a lot of depth with it. So it's one thing if I'm teaching it just to people to teach them the rhythm so that they can just produce something in the rhythm. Like that's what I do for this class I call Magic of Rhythmical Writing, which is the one for the yoga teachers. It's like self-transformation because you journal in the meter, and then you basically, in my opinion, you connect with your mind, body, heart, will, and spirit. So you get like your body or your heart talking to you in its own rhythm. And it's really kind of uncanny how accurate a mirror can be for self-transformation. But that's like not creating poems, that's more process. When I do it for product, for actual poem creation, we go into scansion. People really get excited about the scanning. They get nerdy about it. They're excited about their own poems. If it's a free verse poem, they look at their free verse. Like when you were reading, Bronwen, your wonderful poem that you closed with, there were like so many iambic pentameters near the end. I don't, and sometimes people don't recognize that because they're not listening to, like, if it's a headless one or it has a variation, so it might be slightly hiding, but it's still there. And then, so
I like to sneak the rhythms in.
Yeah. So actually that's a really fun way to when I do come in as a visitor or whatever, and I work with college students who are sort of there and they're metrically resistant, the way I do it then is really to start with their free verse often and point out the meters that are in their free verse. And often there's a dialogue between 2 different meters, and you can kind of look at, this goes back to my PhD dissertation, which was called The Ghost of Meter, University of Michigan Press, The Ghost of Meter, Culture and Prosody in American Free Verse. And I basically did a semiotics of meter using Roland Barthes' SZ, and treating meter as a code. which I call the metrical code. So the idea there is simply that when a free verse or metrically variable poem, when it has lines of meter that come in, like if I were going to look at your poem, for example,
Yeah.
I would look at the iambic pentameters and what they mean. I would scan it and look for other meters, like you might have trochees or anapaests that recur, and look at the meanings of those. And then, you can really show someone, you think you're writing free verse. I mean, you are writing free verse, but there's meter in it. And
Totally.
look, so often, there's like a constellation of meanings around the different meters, so you can see what the meters signify for that poet. And the Ghost of Meter, I extrapolated more larger cultural patterns of meaning. Like if I look at the iambic pentameters in Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, for example, they tend to be about society, conventionality, being trapped, things like that, which is how I got into metrical diversity in the first place, was writing that dissertation. I was like, oh shit, if this is true, I have to start writing dactyls and trochees. I can't just write items, because clearly the semiotics shows that, that my liberation would lie elsewhere. So that's how I started this whole journey, really. So that's a good way to start. And then as quickly as possible, once people see that those patterns unfolding in their own meters, in their own free verse, I would switch to scansion of really good poems in those meters for two reasons. Number one, it's easier to scan poems by poets who are consciously writing in meter. If people spend too much time scanning their own free verse, they can get frustrated because sometimes it's kind of complex scansion. But people like even Longfellow's got some really skillful stuff going on, like Evangeline's, whatever. I mean, there's some, some of it's more popular. Paul Laurence Dunbar, another poet who does great stuff in a variety of meters. So just looking at poems written in the meters and then learning how to scan from those, and then looking at how the variations work. And it's really, they used to call it expressive variation, but I just call it like the identity of body and spirit of the poem, or whatever. Like scansion is a great way to see how the two levels or multiple levels of the poem work together.
I think something I've been thinking about with students this term is that even when you're not writing metrical verse, stresses matter. And even when you're not writing rhyming verse, sound echoes matter, right? And so how to think of those things and degrees of activation or sort of, dispersal of them in a poem, and where that density comes or like subsides is really useful.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then if you realize that even if someone doesn't consciously know they're doing it, they still are using metrical patterns they learned somewhere.
Totally.
And they have picked up meters. And I actually do feel that maybe those meanings are not just cultural, but some of them are physical or kinetic, energetic, like the connection of dactyls with the heart, for example. I'm not sure it's only just people, because most people have never read a poem in dactyls or trochees or anapaests, maybe anapaests from Dr. Seuss, but these meters are not very common anymore, the non-iambic ones. So it's kind of interesting to wonder whether there's, because English only has like one stress every 2 or 3 syllables, and that limits the number of metrical feet you can have. You can have rising double, rising triple, falling double, falling triple. But if you're going to have a language that uses accent as a meaning device, which English does, then you have to have accents. You're going to have it every 2 or 3 syllables. That's going to lead to these basic meters, and so I've even started scanning just casual speech, and I've discovered the same patterns in casual speech as well, which is kind of mind-blowing. I'm just starting to think about that. Anyway, yeah, thanks for that really fun question.
Thank you.
That seems everything about that conversation seems really. I'm going to borrow a line from Bronwen. Not a leap, but a bridge to the translation work that you're doing, Kristen. So, do you want to talk some about how metrical patterning has influenced the decisions you make in translation?
Sure. Hi. Yes. So let's see where to find an opening into the. As I as I was translating Spawn, which is the first collection of Gill's poetry that I worked on, I'm now in the process of finishing up her next collection, which will be coming out in 2022. It was my first like formal book length translation project. And so as I was working on it, I was kind of creating a system for myself while doing it, which is extremely fun. I think it's kind of a macrocosm of a poem where you're creating the rules of the puzzle while also playing the game, right? Creating the rules of the game as you play it. I found myself as I was working on Spawn, the journal that I had on my desk ended up kind of falling into two columns. One where I would be working out the denotative translation, so kind of the baldest possible, making sure that I was getting everything in that Guy's putting in her work. And then the second column was kind of a column in which I would keep track of the sounds that she was using, the patterns I saw emerging sonically, both metric. She makes use of internal rhyme. She makes use of end rhyme. She really plays with a lot of traditional Western formal constraints, but she does it for the purpose of smashing it later on. And so it became very important to, she creates her own internal rules and logic for a lot of French conventions. And then she breaks her own rules later on. And it's always part of her overall project of not writing in French so much as writing through French. And she's very aware of French as this colonialist language. And it's very much a physical presence in the poem that she's acting against through her writings. It's so interesting to see the ways that she's kind of using French against itself, and challenging, but also very fun to try to convey some of that as much as possible in English, and try to honor that project. And so some of the things I saw her doing were playing with conventions like punctuation, sentence fragments, cutting off in the middle of a line, beginning a poem in the middle of a line, and or in the middle of a thought. And so I always tried to, once the kind of trot or the barest possible translation was out, to go back and kind of mentally immerse myself in the sonic elements that she's bringing into the poems. And as I revised, as my publisher could tell you, I was emailing them, day of due date with like little things here and there. I really tried to be as immersed as possible in her sonic elements, and to just kind of like be living and breathing those. And I would be at stoplights and like have a moment where I would need to like stop and write something down. But it was very much an organic process of just trying to make sure that I was honoring and representing those elements in the work. And there's certainly where it's not possible to get both the meaning and the exact or approximate sound in a line, and her poems are very short, so often I'm working within 3 lines trying to make all of this happen in one space. If that's not possible, the book is very much a braided book, and so I found that if I couldn't bring an element in one poem, I could often find a place that made sense later in the collection, and just considering that as sort of, I'm missing the word that I need here, but starts with a C. I'll think of it later. A way of honoring that piece of language or that piece of sound at some point in the collection, if that makes sense.
I love piece of sound. We are coming to the end of our time together. I'm sure that people would be happy to talk more through different kind of methods than this platform. So if you did have something you want to say, then find ways to continue those conversations outside of this. I am just so, again, thrilled to have gotten to spend this 90 minutes with you all. So thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you all the people who attended without.
Thank you. Yay.
Have a good Friday.
It was awesome. Thank you.
It's really fun, everybody. Thank you. Meet you all. Good to see you, Jonathan, to finally meet you for real.
Thanks, everybody.
Hey, Phil. Hey, Jonathan.
you.
Bronwen.
Bye.
See you.
Yay. Love to see you.